Jessica Hooten Wilson is an associate professor of literature and creative writing at John Brown University, where she also serves as the associate director for the Honor Scholars Program and the director of Giving Voice Festival of Writing and the Arts. She received her BA in creative writing from Pepperdine, a master's in English from the University of Dallas, and a PhD in theology and literature from Baylor University, the Notre Dame of the South. Dr. Wilson is the author of several books, Giving the Devil His Due, Flannery O'Connor, and the brothers Karamazov, Walker Percy, Fyodor Dostoevsky, and The Search for Influence, and A Guide to Walker Percy's Novels. And she is currently preparing Flannery O'Connor's unfinished novel, Why Do the Heathen Rage?, for publication. Dr. Wilson's research and teaching interests include Christianity and literature, Catholic literature, and Russian novels. She's a longer friend of the Center for Ethics and Culture, and so it's really our privilege to have you back here on campus at the Morrison. And despite what you might experience today, it's not always this cold on March 5th. So please join me in welcoming Professor Wilson.
So I don't often get a chance to talk to a room full of people that have actually read the story by Flannery O'Connor. I think a lot of times I end up talking to people who haven't read her before, or they read her a long time ago in high school, or they read her in college and now it's been 20 or 30 years and they can't really remember anything except how weird she was. So I think that tonight would go best if I can kind of just walk you through the story and talk about it. Let me tell you about my introduction to Flannery O'Connor. So when I was a teenager, I wanted to be a novelist, and I started writing what came naturally to me, which was dark, grotesque stories. I wanted something to always happen. I wanted someone to die. I wanted someone to get run over. I wanted something dramatic to occur in my stories. And my father worried about this. We were Christian believers, and here I was showing this dark side of humanity with all of its grit and evil. And to appease him, I started writing these light and fluffy and airy stories where everybody got saved and everything's neatly tied up with a bow at the end. And he sent me to a writer's workshop at Rhodes College in which I turned in some of these stories to a professor who said, "These are ghastly. The work you're doing shows that you have some knowledge of writing. You seem to have some ability to write. And yet, why are you writing these poorly done PBS sitcoms with what your talent is?" And he said, "If you want to write and you're a Christian, here's Flannery O'Connor." And he gave me The Life You Save May Be Your Own, and I fell in love with it. I imitated it. It became the source for my aesthetics. O'Connor became the source for my theology. She taught me what words meant, words that I assumed I knew what they meant, but not until I saw them lived out in her stories did I really understand things like forgiveness, love, right? Some of these concepts that I think we just lose the meaning of the words by overusing them or misusing them. And I think when it comes to Parker's back, you really can see that. And so one of the things that I want to focus on with Parker is he is a character who has ears and doesn't hear. He has eyes and doesn't see. And O'Connor knew that this is the audience that she was writing to. If you read some of her essays from Mystery and Manners, she says that for a hostile audience or for those who are deaf, you have to shout. And for those who are blind, you draw the large and startling figures. So she sees herself as a writer, as a Christian novelist, having to write this way in order to speak to her audience. And Parker becomes one of those characters that almost represents the reader in that sense. Right? So you'll see a lot in Parker's back about eyes, characters' eyes, right? If you remember Sarah Ruth's eyes, they're gray and sharp and pointed, right? They cause him pain. I need to set this down. I'll just draw on it if I need to. And they're piercing. It says like ice picks, right? Later on, Parker himself, he's on the gray mechanical ship when he's in the Navy, except for his eyes, which are pale and lifeless. And then at the end of the story, they become cavernous and singed and burned clean. So we'll come back to that. So you have a lot going on with the eyes of the character. Also at the beginning of the story, you have he and his wife are sitting on the front porch, right? She's snapping the beans. And their argument is started over, he's telling her that he's working for a hefty blonde, right? when in fact he's working for a 70-year-old woman who has little concern for him at all, right? So you see that there's an argument, there's a fight between them, and Parker is a liar. We'll look at that a little bit more closely in a second. And the first thing that he says, the first words that ever come out of Parker's mouth, "Aw, shut up for once." And you get a sense that this is what Parker does. Not only does he go through life not seeing, right? He's called blind at one point. He has blurred vision at one point in the text. He ends up losing his sight and is on his back before his sight returns. But also, he's shutting out people's words, right? He says shut up at least twice in the text. At the end when he's in the pool hall, remember? And they're talking to him like, "Oh, you got saved. You're witnessing for Jesus. Oh, shut up." He wants everyone to be quiet. So he doesn't want to see. He doesn't want to hear. He is that audience that wants to be deaf and wants to be blind to the word, right? It's the same as when Jesus was talking to the disciples. You have ears and cannot hear. You have eyes and cannot see, right? So O'Connor's following Jesus by imitating in this way and actually telling stories, telling parables that are speaking to this blind and deaf readership, like Parker. So Parker's change actually occurs midway through his life. He's 14 years old, and I really wish I was teaching a class so I could just kind of ask you what he sees. But he sees this man in front of him at a circus, and this tells you how much the world has changed since the 1960s, right? You would no longer need to go to a circus to see a man covered in tattoos, right? It's just going to be a more common occurrence. But at the time, he sees this man covered from head to foot in tattoos. So this is a character who's blind and deaf, and yet the shockingness of this vision leaves him in awe. His mouth hangs open with reverence. He has emotions that lift him up. And the narrator says it's the same feeling some people have when a flag passes. So here we have Parker having almost a Pledge of Allegiance moment. But what is demanding his allegiance is not the Shema of the gospel, the listen or hear, O Israel, or you must have ears and obey this word. What he's actually responding to is the image of this startling figure that's demanding his allegiance, right? And this is what he tries to image himself after. He doesn't really know what image he's been made in or who he's supposed to look like. When the story has opened, it says that he's sitting there listening to his wife talk, and he's irritated and ashamed of himself, and he can't remember why he married her, right? Pregnant people are his least favorite kind of person. And he's just listening to her babble on and thinking, why did I do this? I do not understand the things that I do. The things that I want to do, I don't do. The things I don't want to do, I do. Does this sound familiar? Right? So this is Parker at the beginning of the story. It says, it was himself he could not understand. Right? It was himself that he can't get. He doesn't know who he is or how he was made or who he's supposed to be. And you'll see this a lot in Flannery O'Connor's stories. So if you've ever read her work before, she's always trying to lead characters to this point of knowing who they are. That's going to be most of the Revelation, is figuring out who you are. So if you've read Revelation, you have Mrs. Ruby Turpin. Do you remember? How am I a hog and from hell as well as a Christian woman? Like, how am I both of these things? I don't understand. And she's yelling at God, like, how can I be this? Who do you think you are to call me this? To tell me who you think I am? Right? So this is a constant place for O'Connor, or a good man is hard to find. Right? The story ends when the grandmother recognizes her face in another. Right? She recognizes her connection to this other person. Why, you're one of my babies. And it's this point of conversion moment. It's a starting place for conversion for these characters, right? To know who they are. So Parker has to get a vision of himself different than the one he has. The one he has right now is to look like this tattoo man. And so he starts chasing tattoos. And he begins simple, gets the lifeless figures, anchors, hearts with his mom's name in it, cards, right? And then he starts moving up the chain of being and gets the panthers and the eagles and the hawks. And at one point in the text, he says he feels as though the tattoos have penetrated him and are raging within him. So we're getting a foreshadowing for later that the images on him are penetrating and telling him who he is. They're becoming part of him. And that's going to be important for what happens, of course, at the end of the story. But he doesn't get an image on his back. So he's getting all these images over him, and it says that he's chasing tattoo after tattoo after tattoo. He has this continual sense of dissatisfaction that's leading him to do this. And yet he has this huge canvas on the back that he's not filling up. And if you remember from the text, the exact reason, and with O'Connor, everything is both literal, and then there's always that figurative meaning that you have to pay attention to. So in the text, it says he didn't want to have to hold two mirrors behind him to look at his image because it would make him look like an idiot to do so. Okay, there are two things happening there on a figurative level. Parker doesn't want to be an idiot, right? So when he meets Sarah Ruth, think back to one of their earlier conversations, and he's like, hey, do you like my tattoos? I like that chicken, okay. Chicken? She's like, that chicken. Oh, the eagle? What kind of fool would get a chicken on themselves? And she says, what kind of fool would do any of it? Right? He does not want to be foolish, and yet that continually ends up where he is. He's looking like a fool. He's looking like an idiot. In O'Connor's fiction, you have to watch out for that word, because for her, it's not a negative. The foolish ones or the idiots are the ones who have the presence of God in them. And she says this in her letters, that she believes that God is as present, if not more so, in the idiot as in the genius. And of course, what she means by that is this understanding that the foolishness of the world is the wisdom of God. And so those characters who are the idiots or the fools are the ones who are actually living out the genius of God in the world. But Parker doesn't want that kind of image. That's not how he sees himself, and that's not how he wants to be seen. And it's very important to him that he sees himself a certain way and shows himself a certain way, right? So the back image to fill up that canvas would be for the benefit of other people, and it would just make him look like an idiot. So he has nothing there. Now, Sarah Ruth does not believe that anybody should have images on them. She calls it idolatry, right? Vanity of vanities. And in some sense, even though she is normally wrong in the narrative, even the demons speak truth, if you remember the Gospels. O'Connor's a big fan of putting truth into the mouths of those who seem demonic. And vanity of vanities it is. She's right. He is trying to image himself. He says that he does it because it gives him power over the women, the kind of girls that he wants to attract, who never saw him before. Whereas before he called himself ordinary as a loaf of bread, he believes that these colorful images transform him from the gray into the colorful, and they will make him empowered. And yet Sarah Ruth actually demotes him. For her, she has power over him. He's pretending that he has power over her, but he knows that it's not there. And so the idea takes him that maybe if I get the right image on my back, I can have that power over her. If I get a religious image, it says one that she could not resist, one that would have to make her heel. That's the kind of language you use with the dog, right? To make them heel. And so he wants to put a religious image on his back that's going to make her heel, that's going to make her see him differently. And so he starts thinking about like putting a Bible on his back. And of course she thinks this is a foolish notion. And it's not until he has a near-death experience that he begins to decide exactly what needs to be on his back. The image that, of course, will make him look like an idiot in a positive way, in a Christian way. So he's driving the tractor and he's thinking about what image he wants when he gets blinded by the sun. You know, sometimes O'Connor's just really obvious. Okay, we have a Paul Damascus type moment here. He gets blinded by the sun, which is going both behind him as though he has eyes in the back of his head and coming in front of him. In some sense, this is the sun that has been chasing him the entire story. Another trope for O'Connor is that God works that way. God is this Hound of Heaven figure. Are any of you familiar with the 19th century poem, The Hound of Heaven? Becomes an inspiration for her. So God chases you down and doesn't let you go, right? And in The Hound of Heaven, it's always called the voice, right? So when God talks, it doesn't say God says. It says the voice says. So this is going to be important. We have a blind and deaf character, And we need to hear the voice that's going to come up later, the voice that's been hounding him. At one point in the text, it says he felt like someone was trailing him, and he's a little worried that maybe he's going crazy because his granddaddy went crazy, thinking people were following him. But of course, this is the God that is hounding him, that is pursuing him in this narrative. And O'Connor does this quite a bit in her fiction. So he crashes the tractor into a tree. The tree bursts into flame, and his shoes catch fire. Right? He must remove his shoes. I mean, it's holy ground. And he curses, as he's been doing throughout the narrative, but think about how he's cursing differently. At the beginning, when he's feigning or lying or pretending that he has a hurt hand, he says, Jesus Christ in hell, good God in hell, my hand hurts, right? So it's God in hell. In this moment when he crashes the tractor, he says, God above, right? So it's God where God is. Not below him, as it has been throughout the narrative, but above him. So he's beginning to have some sort of inclination, even if he couldn't explain it, that God is above him in this moment. And he's down, and he must take off his shoes in this place of holy ground. It says if he would have known how to cross himself, he would have, right? He recognizes that this is a divine encounter, even though he can't tell why or how. So he goes into the artist, the tattoo parlor. And this is a man who's seen him a lot. But at this point, the man doesn't recognize him. So think about this. He's been trying to image himself, to see himself a certain way. And yet God has actually transfigured him, that when he walks in, he's unrecognizable to this man. There's been a change in Parker. And the text says that his eyes were hollowed out or cavernous and calls them singed as though burned. In O'Connor, fires are not damnation fires, they're purgatorial. They burn one clean. So you see something in like The Violent Bear It Away, there's a character who's running from God the entire time and has these battling voices in his head. One of them is the voice of Jesus, and one of them is the voice of the demonic. And they're playing for who are you going to be like, Jesus or the demonic. And in the narrative, the young man actually experiences a fire for numerous reasons that I won't go into because you haven't read the novel. I don't want to give too much away. But his eyes get singed, and he takes on the call of the prophecy and submits to the voice and obeys it. So this is a move that she's constantly making in her work. So he walks in, and he's going to pick out an image for his back. And as he's turning these pages, trying to figure out which image of God he wants, he tries to ignore the eyes that see him from the pages. The eyes meet his, and he tries to look beyond them. And it says, as though silence were a language. Come on, St. John of the Cross, right? Silence is God's first language. And this is a man who has not been able to hear and has not been able to see, and yet here he is being seen for who he is. And the text says he felt as though the eyes penetrated him, saw through him like the wings of a fly, saw through him clearly. They see him for who he is, and the voice, which is silence, says, go back, right? The voice demands obedience that Parker has not been giving, and Parker assents and gets the picture of Christ on his back. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the Pantocrator image, most people assume that this is the image of Christ that they're talking about, right? The all-demanding eyes is the way that it's described. So you now have him enfleshing himself with this image of Christ. And the tattoos that we saw earlier, the way that they penetrate and take over Parker, now this image penetrates Parker. Right? As much as he doesn't want to witness to Jesus, he's literally become an incarnate icon of Jesus. What's significant about this is he doesn't want to look at the image because he doesn't want the eyes to look at him. How many of you have read Jean-Luc Marion, God Without Being? It's fantastic. So one of the things that hit me when I was reading that book and reading this text is Jean-Luc Marion talks about the difference between the idol and the icon, the difference between the mirror in which you look into the mirror and see yourself as you want to see you, and you can't see more than that. So it's a subjective view on yourself, seeing the way, so you see this like circle, this tautology that's impossible to get out of when you're trying to see yourself or know yourself. versus the view of the icon, which is not idolatrous, which actually the invisible views you and reads you and sees you as you are. So it's a different way of understanding yourself. O'Connor said that self-knowledge will ultimately be a humbling act because one will see what they lack. They will see the truth and measure themselves against it rather than measure the truth against themselves. So you actually change your paradigm for viewing the world. And that's what happens to Parker. He's been trying to image himself, trying to look at himself in a mirror the whole time. And instead, now he has the icon infleshed in him in which it can see him and demand obedience from him. He's sitting, he goes into the pool hall, which is like his normal place of refuge, right? And they're all trying to see his tattoo, and they're telling him, you're witnessing for Jesus now, you've been converted, and he's telling them to be quiet. He gets so angry that they get into a fight and they throw him out. The narrator says it's like Jonah getting thrown out of the ship, right? And he ends up sitting outside like a contemplative on the ground behind the pool hall, examining his soul. This is a crazy moment. You have this character who this whole time has been in charge of his fate, doing his own will. I mean, just like Jonah, running from the Lord, and has been dropped down flat and is sitting there thinking about his soul, something which, in his opinion, wasn't even necessary, is what it says, and yet he couldn't escape this feeling. And instead of determining his will at this moment, he wants to go to Sarah Ruth so that she can be in charge of him. This is a new move for him too, right? To submit to someone else. That's a starting place to submitting to God, is to submitting to a neighbor. So he runs back to his wife. She'll know what to do. No longer wanting to dominate her, no longer wanting to convict her with the image, but actually to hear from her what to do. And when he gets there, of course, the door is locked. He starts banging on the door, wants to get in. And the text never says that Sarah Ruth calls out to him. Instead, it says, the voice said, who's there? The voice said, who's there? And it says it 3 or 4 times. Who's there? Who's there? And it's making him claim his name. And he doesn't want to claim who he is. He doesn't want to see himself the way that God sees him, right? He's given himself his own name. He's made his flesh exactly what he wanted to make it. He thinks he's been in charge of all these decisions, when in reality, God's been pursuing him this entire time. And he gets hit by the dawn, by this light coming at him that pins him against the door like a lance. And he whispers the response, Obadiah, Elihu. He claims his name. He claims who he is. She opens the door. She starts telling him the truth. She sees through his lies. The old lady came over, ruined the tractor, and he tries to get her to look at this picture. It's God. Don't you recognize God? And the first thing that she does is not recognize God. She beats him with a broom. And the suffering servant that he put on his back literally becomes a suffering in his flesh as the welts rise to the surface. And he runs from that moment onto a tree. I mean, some of it's just really heavy, but it's very sacramental, like runs onto the tree and is holding onto the tree like a penitent, like holding onto the foot of the cross, weeping over his sin. And it says Obadiah Elihu crying like a baby. The man who didn't want to be a fool and didn't want to be an idiot is now the suffering baby starting over, holding onto the tree. Now, a lot of people read O'Connor's stories and they always want to know, okay, what happens next, right? The grandmother gets shot. What are we supposed to do with that? In Revelation, she gets down and walks back to her house. In Parker's back, he's crying against a tree. Do we know what happens? What's next? And I think this is when you have to remember what O'Connor's doing. She's writing parables like the way she sees Jesus doing, in which Jesus tells you a story. He doesn't want to tell you everything about how to read that story. But at the end of it, once you realize the story and its meaning, what does Jesus say? Go then and do likewise. At the end, the important thing is that we as readers have ears to hear and eyes to see, and we can go out and do likewise, that we can finish the story. that was started, the one that she told us. So let's have some discussion. About Parker.